Good evening, my friends. This is William Lee on the 7th of October, 2024, and it's late. It's about 10 o'clock in the evening, or 2200, and it's just been one of those days, as I mentioned in my earlier Grand Duke Dmitri videos. So yeah, I'm doing this late, but I'm doing it. That's the important thing, I guess. Yeah, I'm here with an icon of the last Russian Tsar and his family, and the last Russian emperor, in their Byzantine / Muscovite clothing, or rather I should say their Muscovite / Byzantine clothing, because this was Muscovite clothing that was in several respects borrowed from Byzantium. And I've got a Swiss memorial candle, and unfortunately this reproduction icon can't really glitter the way the real thing would if you were to go into a Greek Orthodox church or chapel and see one there. But it is what it is. So today we are leaving decisively, really, Muscovy and the 17th century behind us. We've had a bridge from the 17th to the 18th century, and from Muscovy to Imperial Russia, in the form of two men, the only two co-tsars in Russian history, Peter the Great and his brother Ivan V, perfectly embodying Imperial Russia in Peter, and Holy Mother Rus in the meek and pious Ivan V. So they not only bridge the centuries, but they bridge two worlds, really. Two worlds, although they're all part of Russian history. So Ivan was a bridge, or Ivan was a bridge that wasn't going to make it all the way to the other shore when it came to reaching Imperial Russia. He died at the age of 29, and I think that was appropriate. You know, I'm sorry that he died at the age of 29, but I'm saying in terms of thematically, God forbid the span of people's lives should be determined thematically, but yeah, it was apt in a way that he didn't live on into the end of his brother Peter the Great's reign, when Russia was very definitely then an empire. So I have been a little lax in providing dates up to now, so I will add that the two brothers both came to the throne. One is a 16-year-old, one is a 9-year-old, in 1682, and as I said, Ivan was 29 when he died. Peter, who died in 1825, was 52 years old. He died of uremia. It was a natural death. It was a gruesome one. He actually had gangrene in his bladder, very painful. And though he had had sons, he left no sons behind him. And one of the biggest lapses of his entire life, and certainly his life as Tsar and then Emperor of Russia, was that despite having changed the law so that every Russian ruler could name his own successor, Peter did not name a successor. He left no sons and he left no successor. So his wife came to the throne, a low-born woman of Baltic German ancestry, among other things, and she only outlived her husband by 2 years. So she was the ruler of Russia after Peter's death in 1725 until 1727. She was 43 years old at the time of her death. She died from tuberculosis. She was a woman who had had 12 children, but only 2 of them survived her, and those were both daughters. So there were no sons to fill the traditional role as heir, but she did name an heir, and she named her step-grandson, Peter's biological grandson, the son of the former heir to the throne, Alexei. Peter had murdered his son Alexei for his backward-looking views, and this was the grandson, Peter Alexeyevich, who became Peter II, but he was a child. So he became emperor in 1727. He died 3 years later in 1730. He was 14 years old. He left no children, not surprisingly. He died of smallpox, and he did not stipulate an heir. So who came next? It wasn't one of Peter's daughters, although we already had a precedent and no legal obstacle for a woman becoming the sovereign, the Romanov sovereign. So, and it was a woman, but it was not one of Peter's daughters. It was one of Ivan's daughters. Her name was Anna, so we can call her Anna the First, although there was not another Anna, and I'm guessing probably will not be another Anna in Russia, ruling Russia. Although who knows, stranger things have happened. So she actually had a decent length on the throne. She came to the throne in 1730, and she remained on the throne for 10 years and died in 1740. So the length of her reign wasn't really the issue. The issue, or rather the non-issue, was the fact that she had no children. So once again, the Romanovs were not fulfilling their dynastic duty, one could say, and this absolutely pressing need of, in the first place, producing children, and in the second place, making sure that there's someone firmly identified, even if it's not one of their own children or even a member of the family, to succeed them. So, yeah, Anna dies in 1740. She does have an heir. She has named as her heir her nephew, who is the great-grandson of her own father, Ivan, Peter's co-ruler, and this great-grandson is an infant. He's 3 years old. He's not only a babe in arms, but he's a little German boy, born in Germany to a German father and a German mother who happened to have a connection to the Russian royal house through Ivan V. So this little boy was brought from Germany, only, I think he was actually less than 3 months old. And he ended up reigning for about 1 year. So very short reign, but if you're thinking that he died, and you would be justified in thinking so because of the very high infant mortality at that time, well, he didn't die. In fact, he was unceremoniously and cruelly pushed off the throne by Peter's daughter, Elizabeth. And he survived that. Apparently, she could not quite bring herself, as her father had done, to kill someone who stood in the way of her own plans for Russia. She couldn't bring herself to kill this infant. So she had him locked up in the Schlüsselburg fortress, and she left instructions that he was not to be educated beyond being taught to read so that he could read the Bible, and that he was, if his identity and his survival were ever discovered, it had been told, the public had been told that Tsar or Emperor Ivan VI had died, and if that lie should ever be discovered, he was to be murdered immediately. So he grew up in the Schlüsselburg fortress, and when his identity, when he was 23 years old, his continued presence as a living person and as a crowned Russian emperor was discovered by a man named Count Mirovich, I'm not sure, I'm always bad with stress. And so he was indeed murdered because of that discovery, and he died at the age of 23 years, obviously leaving no heirs. And, one of the saddest stories, you could say, affecting an individual in Russian history, something out of a novel, really. And in fact, centuries later, in 1907, two other little Romanovs, well, not so little, Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich and his sister, Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna the Younger, who were 16 and 17 years old at that time, would be reading a novel about Ivan VI's life. So that's kind of interesting and ironic, actually. I should have written down the author's name. I do have it written down somewhere, and I actually would rather like to read that book myself. So this ended the most precarious stage of the existence of the Romanov dynasty. So the Romanov dynasty had been established as a dynasty in 1613. It was now at the time of Elizabeth's accession, 1741. And this most precarious period of the dynasty's existence was past. There had been no more time of troubles. There had not been another Smuta like there was when Ivan IV, the last Rurik ruler, had died, and 30 years had passed before another ruler was established on the throne, and that was the first Romanov, Tsar Michael. Well, that had been averted. So that's good, I guess. Some blood was spilled, and when Peter and Ivan V came to the throne, and then poor Ivan VI's blood was spilled by his cousin, I guess. And now we're coming into a more stable period of Russian history when we still don't have any Grand Dukes, because once again in the 18th century the Romanovs were just not adept at having children who would survive childhood, or on the other hand, even having children at all. So Elizabeth, like her cousin Anna, would not marry and not have any children. But there would, I don't want to get into that now, but there would never be, there would not be another succession crisis during the remainder of the 18th century. There would, however, be two more Russian emperors murdered. So Peter III and Paul I would both be murdered, joining Ivan VI. So that was a rough century for the Romanovs. 3 Romanov emperors murdered, and the dynasty itself almost becoming extinct. All right, so to finish this up, I'm going to try something a little different. We'll see how it works. I'm going to try actually reading some text from the work that all of this is based on, which is my doctoral dissertation. If from the University of London School of Slavonic and East European Studies, and the title is Grand Ducal Role and Identity as a Reflection on the Interaction of State and Dynasty in Imperial Russia. And to avoid my usual sort of stilted speech and muddleheadedness, I'm going to try glancing at this and reading, and if it also comes out stilted or even more stilted, then I won't do it next time. But yeah, maybe it will be even more fluent than I usually am. So let's do that. So this is a part of the text entitled The Post-Petrine 18th Century, and this will be an overview of the 18th century. So you will hear references to, we'll have references to, and we'll discuss Elizabeth, Peter III, Catherine the Great, Paul I, the other rulers of the 18th century. But we're going to look at once there are actual Grand Dukes during the reigns of Catherine and Paul. We're going to look at those two reigns in detail, because the whole point of this exercise is to talk about where the Grand Dukes stood in the dynasty and in the harmony or disharmony that prevailed between the state and the dynasty as parallel and as sometimes rival institutions. So we're not skipping anything when I talk about these later rulers, these later 18th century rulers. We are going to come back and look at in detail at the Grand Dukes, who finally the dynasty had some Grand Dukes. So we're going to look in detail at those reigns from the perspective of the Grand Dukes and what their role was. All right, so I've already talked for nearly 20 minutes, so I won't go much longer with this. We've got a good foundation, knowing who the rulers were in the 18th century. Okay, so if Peter's co-elevation to the throne had marked a tentative shift away from the mystical and static religiosity which had formed such an important part of the original Romanov mythos, so the Muscovite mythos, if Peter himself had grown to redefine that mythos as a heroic imperial ideal, then the post-Petrine 18th century would witness the seizure of that ideal by the service elite as a means of self-empowerment. And if you recall, in the Petrine service elite, if you reached officer's rank, if you reached the 8th rung on the service ladder, the table of ranks, then you were ennobled. So is it now, in Peter's absence, going to be the case that it is the servitors, the once reluctant nobility, who are going to push forward and maintain and champion the idea of Russia as a great power? Or is it going to be the ruler who does that, or is it going to be both of those institutions, and how will that work out? Okay, so the conceptual importance of the state to the heirs of the Petrine service establishment can scarcely be underestimated. So Richard Wortmann points to changes in coronation ceremonies in the immediate post-Petrine period as evidence of the sacred character now attributed to the state. So, of course, the emperor was still considered to be sacred, but now the state symbols are being produced to show that the state is also has a sacred character. So Richard Wortmann is a scholar whom I admire greatly, and he wrote a fabulous book called Scenarios of Power, and I read it, of course, when I was doing my dissertation, and it was one of the most helpful books, and anybody with the slightest interest in the Romanovs or in the pre-revolutionary Russia should absolutely read this book. The problem is that last time I checked, it appeared to be out of print, and you could only you could, you were going to be paying more than $100 for a copy. So unfortunately, I have not reread it. I can't afford that kind of money. I guess I'm going to have to try and see if I can get it through interlibrary loan. But if you can get a hold of it, it's one of the books that I would most recommend. So Wortman, what he does is he goes through and he analyzes all the symbols and texts and things like that that speak to that are communicating to people what's important in Russia and how it's important and how they should be looking at it. And so an enormously informative and useful book. And he's saying that as of this time, in post-Petrine 18th century Russia, things are being brought forward to make sure that people see how important the dynasty itself views the state. Okay, so beyond this, the succession crises, which followed Peter's death in 1825 and continued until the accession of Elizabeth in 1741, gave the nobility, from whom the service elite was drawn, power to determine the political future of the empire. So bear in mind that another thing to bear in mind is that you had to be a hereditary nobleman at that time, in order to be an officer or at a high level in the Russian administrative state. But as I said, the table of ranks, it was still supposed to be a meritocratic system, where you could start out with very humble origins. You could be a free peasant and still make your way up all the way to the top if you were talented enough, if you deserved it, if you merited it, if you worked hard, and if you were exceptionally capable. Then you were exactly the kind of person that Peter wanted as a champion of the Russian state. So that's another big issue. That's another big issue. Is the meritocratic state going to survive? Is the principle of meritocracy going to survive? At this point, anybody who's invested in Russia is a great power, wants the great power to survive. But are the nobility going to continue to embrace this idea of a meritocratic service system? Okay, so in the absence now of Peter the Great, the service elite are looking to have a part and really to be the determiners of the political future of the empire. So Catherine I, an uneducated woman, had, a servant. When she'd started out in life, she did establish a Supreme Privy Council in 1726, so a year after her husband died, and she had the backing of Peter the Great's closest friend, Menshikov, a man of humble background, who had been elevated to the top of the service order and the aristocracy and was very wealthy, and he backed Catherine as Peter's successor, and no doubt had a hand in this Supreme Privy Council, and that went fine. But then when she died in 1730, the aristocratic members of the council wanted to rule as a sort of oligarchy. And they invited Peter I's daughter, Anna, to reign as a puppet monarch. So she would be just a symbolic monarch, and there would be this aristocratic privy council that would be really running Russia. Well, nice try. It didn't work because they were a relatively small group within the nobility, and the other nobles were actually still on board. They wanted an autocrat, and they made sure that this attempt failed, and that instead of Peter's daughter Anna, it was Peter's grandson, Peter II, who was brought to the throne, just as Catherine I herself had stipulated. He was the one that she had named as her heir. So it was opposition from their own fellow nobles that prevented this coup, I guess you could call it, from taking place, prevented Russia from becoming an oligarchy instead of an autocracy. Whether that was a good thing or a bad thing, that's the way things turned out. So, yeah, let's see. So, yeah, they were not ready, as I write, to conceive of a state truly independent of the ruler, but they certainly were ready to demand more caste privileges, which Anna readily granted. So, you know, they had her back, and she gave them more privileges than they'd had previously. So Peter had been very harsh with the nobles. You know, you could not stay out on your country estate if you wanted to have any place in Imperial Russia at all. Literally, if you wanted to have a public role or beyond that, to just be able to hold your head up in society and come to the capital and not be an outcast, then you had to serve, and you had to serve well enough to achieve a rank. But now things are going to get a little slacker, you know, because Anna and the succeeding rulers are not going to be quite as strict about these things. So as I say, we'll see how much the meritocratic ideal, how far it goes. Okay, so the military service elite played a particularly powerful role in the choice of Russia's 18th century rulers. And if you wanted to succeed on the throne, if you wanted to have a stable reign at that period of time, you needed the members of the top regiments, the officers of the top regiments, to back you. So these were basically the guards regiments. And Peter had indeed managed to inculcate in them the idea that the basis of their personal honor, their individual identity, and their, everything that they cared about came from their role as being the military elite. Not necessarily the aristocratic elite, but the military elite, the top officers, the guards officers. That was what they took pride in now. And so they backed Catherine, and they backed Anna, and they would back Elizabeth. So let's see what we have here. So Elizabeth, at her 1742 coronation, willingly presented prominent servitors to the public as champions of the empire's well-being. So this could not be more explicit. They are champions dedicated to the upholding of Russia's honor. Their individual honor and the empire's honor are one and the same thing. And Catherine II, in her accession manifesto, made it clear that the struggle against Peter III, her husband, who happened to be one of these emperors who was murdered by her, incidentally, or at her behest, had been a struggle to secure Russia's future. So she's going to justify her accession to the throne as the Emperor Catherine II by saying that this was her way of securing Russia's future, not the holy Batushka Tsar's future. He had to be gotten out of the way, but geopolitical Russia's future. All right, so yeah, I guess that went well. Let me know if you think it didn't, and I will be back next week, whether by candlelight or not by candlelight. So do please come back for that, and I'll see you then. Bye.